My name is Sarah Westbrook. Welcome to the Yoga Posers podcast. And today I'm alone. There's no Jane. And I'm really sad about that. But Jane has come upon an amazing opportunity that she has to pursue. And it's in line with her pelvic floor therapy work and her work with aging and aging well with yoga therapy. And so it was too good to pass up, and she needed to prioritize her time. So we miss Jane, and I hope that she will be hosting with me again on episodes in the future. Looking forward, we will have some guest hosts that I'm super excited to work with. Those of you who listen to this podcast, it's on YouTube, and there's a video. And you can see me and Jane and all of our past ones. There's images, there's even some short videos, so you can see what we're talking about. For today, I thought I would try an episode by myself, and we're doing a super simple one. It's child's pose. So easy. We always take these like super simple poses and we're like, this will be no problem. What could be simpler than child's pose? But I have found in my own experience and in students' bodies that child's pose can be surprisingly hard on hips, on knees, and on ankles. So we're going to unpack child's pose, which should be a resting pose, and resting and gathering yourself and composing yourself in a practice is really valuable. In a level 2 vinyasa class, you might be doing that in downward dog, but you'll also have opportunities to do that in child's pose. And child's pose is famously a resting pose. So you do something vigorous, and then the teacher says, lower down to your knees, come back to child's pose, find your breath. One of the most common cues, find your breath. So child's pose is Balasana in Sanskrit, and it means the child. And it is a kneeling pose. Sometimes it's called Adho Mukha Virasana. So it's the downward facing, like Adho Mukha Svanasana, downward facing dog. Adho Mukha, downward facing Virasana, the hero's pose, which is that kneeling pose. So it's basically like that pose. You kneel, sit on your heels or between your heels, and then fold forward. Your spine is generally rounded. Your arms are often stretched out in front of you in shoulder flexion. That's the picture we're thinking of when we think of child's pose. Once you understand the mechanics of what child's pose is all about, how we want your joints to behave, you'll find that it's a really decent platform for exploring trickier things like shoulder flexion, getting your arms overhead comfortably like we do in Warrior One, like we do in Downward Facing Dog especially. So child's pose is a great place, once it's comfortable in your knees and your ankles and your hips, to explore some shoulder work. So I think it's very valuable to find a way to be comfortable in this pose. So as we've done in the past, we'll break down this pose body part by body part, starting from the feet and moving up. And as I do that, we'll address some of our common complaints. Okay, who could not like child's pose, you might say? Lots of people. So common complaints in this pose are discomfort in the feet, especially if you have a bunion, discomfort in the ankles, pinching at the knee, pressure on the knee. It's very deep flexion. The knee is bent deeply, so that compression is often difficult for people, and many people can't do it as they age because of that. And then there's often a pinch in the hip crease, which is very rarely talked about and often not noticed. After the pinch in the hip crease, we might have discomfort in the low back. This is a rounded low back pose. Its intention is to stretch the low back and the structures of the back, even the sacral area. And so if you happen to be very rounded there already, a lumbar flexion person, we call that, with a lot of rounding in the low back, a lot of tendency to tuck in the pelvis, this pose might not feel great for you. And then with the arms overhead, it can feel difficult in the shoulders as the arms stretch out along the floor. So let's take apart the pose bit by bit. So the feet are often pointed, and that's called plantar flexion for the teachers and curious students out there. And when we point the feet, we'll often see one of the first most common misalignments in the pose. Those of you that are flexible, the fronts of your ankles will be touching the floor. And then there'll be students for whom there's like 4 to 6 inches of space between the front of the ankle and the floor. So some people are really good at pointing so much that they collapse into the front of the ankle. Front of the ankle's on the floor. Doesn't bother them necessarily. Other students, it can be uncomfortable because it's so difficult for them to point the feet. I would say if the front of your ankles are touching the mat, you need to press all 10 toenails down into the floor and try to lift the fronts of the ankles off the mat. Not a lot, just a little bit, just to create some space there. When I do this myself, I actually start to feel a little bit of stretch in my quads, the front of my thighs, which is another intention of this pose. When we get to the knees, we get into some common cueing issues. Traditionally, I would say this pose is done with the thighs parallel, like Virasana. Often teachers cue it with the knees apart. Why would we do that? So thinking about our other episodes and what we've talked about, when the hips are abducted, when the knees are wider, that's called hip abduction, the hips flex more quickly, more readily. So for people who have trouble getting their butt to their heels, widening the knees is often helpful. If you're pregnant or if you're carrying a lot of weight in the front of the body, just getting that mass out of the way by widening your knees is very helpful. What's happened in most classes, though, is that teachers think, well, this is the way everybody should do the pose, where what happens if you're very flexible, you already flex your hips really easily. You might then arch your low back in the pose. You might not get that stretch that you really need in the low back. So for very flexible students whose butts reach your heels, I would say close your knees or bring your thighs parallel. And you might find that your low back then rounds. We can slow down that hip flexion. Anytime we narrow the legs, it slows down hip flexion. And then that will get you to that low back stretch, which is very helpful for our lumbar extension types, those who arch in the back too easily, who flex the hips too quickly. Okay, so if we back up a little bit to the knees themselves, if we'd like to reduce compression is that squeezing force on the knees. We need to open up the back of the knee. We need to create space there. Slide a blanket between the back of your calves and the back of your thighs and pull the blanket all the way into the knee pit, just like the armpit. I like to call the back of the knee pit. Take a blanket there. It feels amazing for those of you who can collapse the knee joint really easily and flex really easily. And it also will reduce the compression for those of you that need more space at the back of the knee if you're starting to get some arthritis there. Even further than that, go ahead and sit up on a block between your ankles, between your feet. Just raising the floor makes more space at the back of the knee. And sometimes we do that in regular Virasana, the kneeling pose. We'll sit on a block at its lowest height, block at its middle height, 2 blocks stacked at the middle height or even higher to make space at the knee and feel what happens when we take this kneeling prostration type shape and just give ourselves a little bit more space. It's more sustainable. You can hold it for a longer period of time. I feel like I'm going through the pose so quickly without Jane here. And it's so strange to do this not in a conversation format. I definitely miss that. But let me know what you think in the comments. I'm trying to imagine what Jane would be saying. I think Jane would be saying energetically, this pose is grounding, calming. It allows you to lengthen your exhales. This is something that teachers often look for when we want to calm students, is lengthen those exhales, especially if you're in a resting pose like this. It's grounding. What does that mean? Grounding is one of those abstract concepts. We could even say relaxing or resting. Everyone knows what we mean intellectually, I think, when we say that. But as teachers, we're trying to get beyond using abstract terminology and get into metaphors and feeling words and evocative words that help students get to the state that we want. So when something's grounding, it feels settled, calm, maybe more descriptive, heavy. Instead of the body feeling like it's lifting away from the floor and rising up in the room, when you do child's pose, especially after a vigorous sequence, you can feel your body grateful for the floor, grateful for the rest, willing to release muscular tension. So releasing muscular tension is softening. So child's pose can feel softening, heavy, released, surrendering, letting go, like dropping heavy luggage after a long trip. That kind of sigh, longer exhale, release. Now, of course, if you're pressing all 10 toenails into the floor to make space under the ankle, it's going to take away some of that restful capacity. So the more flexible you are, if you add back some stability in this pose, you're kind of stealing the joy of just chilling out and letting go. So if you don't feel like actively keeping space at the front of the ankle, roll up a part of your blanket and place it at the front of the ankles, and the rest of it can go under the shins towards the knees, and we get a little bit more space there passively so you can still relax. Okay. If we now go back to the hips and whether or not they're flexing too quickly or too slowly, we get to the crux of whether or not child's pose is actually helpful for people. So I love to have students come to hands and knees, table pose, and do cat-cow. So they're flexing and extending their hips, right, which sometimes we often call, as yoga teachers, tilting the pelvis forward and back as a cue, but flex the hips, extend the hips. Students don't know what that is, so we say tilt your pelvis forward, tilt your pelvis back. Students know that a little better. And so what we find in this pose is that as people go through cat-cow, we're seeing how much hip mobility they have. And then you send them in neutral spine back to child's pose and see what happens. Does the back immediately round? Do the hips immediately extend? Or we could say, does the pelvis immediately tuck? And then often those hips will not get back to the heels. Come back up to hands and knees. Arch the back like cobra. Sit bones up. You could call that a forward tilt. You could call that flexing your hips. And sit bones wide, tailbone up towards the ceiling, a little arch in the low back. Then have that student go back, maintaining that arch on the way back to child's pose. Once they're past their knees, halfway to their heels, then they can start to round a little bit. They're going to get much closer to the heels. One of the things we'd like to see in this pose as teachers is that students aren't balancing with all the weight on their head and their butt 2 feet over their knees. If they're not able to get the hips back over the heels and at least somewhat close to the feet, this is not a great resting pose for them. So to help that student flex better, what do we say? We're going to widen the knees. We widen the knees so the hips can flex faster. We can arch the back so the hips flex faster. We can try to keep the tailbone up as that student goes back. Now, all of that's great for your stiffer lumbar flexion type student whose butt doesn't reach their heels in child's pose, but it's not going to be great for the student who's more lumbar extension type, who easily arches their back, whose butt already comes back to their heels very quickly and easily in child's pose. For that student, I would say close the knees, round the back as you come into child's pose, because their hips flex so automatically, so quickly, that they actually have to try to slow that down by doing the exact opposite. That student can take the Halloween cat shape. We call that cat pose. Press the palms into the floor, round the back, and then go to child's pose. Their butt will still reach their heels, but then they're actually not getting a pinch in the hip crease. And they're getting a stretch in their low back, which those students really need. And entering the pose this way for them feels great. If you've got a mixed class as a teacher, or if you're a student and you don't know which type you are, try going into the pose from the Halloween cat shape. See how it feels when you're in child's pose. Come back up to table, arch the back, tailbone up, sit bones up, and then come back trying to maintain that arch in your low back. See if you get closer to your feet and if that feels good for you. Okay, so depending upon how you enter child's pose and then how the pose actually feels, you start to learn what type of person you are. Oh, I'm starting to think I'm a lumbar extension person. My back arches really easily. I can flex my hips easily. My butt always reaches my heels in child's pose. Hey, I can close my knees and I can get a low back stretch, which I know I love because when I lie on my back, I hug my knees into my chest and I love that. Lying on your back and hugging your knees into the chest is child's pose on the back. It's the same pose. And it's often a lot more accessible because you're not compressing the knees. You're not putting your full body weight on the hips, squeezing them, full body weight on the knees, squeezing them, full body weight on the ankles or on a bunion and pressing those, compressing those. Think of yoga poses as shapes that we can turn upside down. That's how you make poses more accessible. It's disempowering to be told that you shouldn't do the pose. Don't do the pose. The pose isn't good for you. Well, if someone's patient enough to use props, you can make a lot of poses work. That being said, we also know, having listened to many episodes now, that there is structural variation in people's hips. That means architecturally, some people's bones, the way they're twisted or positioned, the way the hip socket is positioned, where it's positioned on the pelvis itself, changes how readily you can rotate the hips. So we see rotation in the hips most easily by noticing when someone's standing, if their feet turn out habitually all the time, the whole life, everyone in their family, they all turn their feet out. Or vice versa. Everyone in their family pigeon toes their feet, their knees knock in, they toe in, and that's just how they've always been. But some people, it's less clear than that. And even those habits are not clear indications that there's something structural going on. What can be a clear indication that something structural is going on is that you can't get into child's pose without a lot of discomfort in your hips and knees. Even if you widen your knees, even if you change how you're arching or rounding your back, there's no difference. This relatively internally rotated pose, child's pose, is not available to you. You're miserable, you hate it, it's not restful. Well, try sitting cross-legged then. So when we sit cross-legged, we let the knees fall out into abduction. They're also externally rotated. Sit cross-legged, fold forward. If you're like, easy, knees almost drop to the floor or they touch the floor. If you're really retroverted and you really prefer that external rotation in your hips, go ahead and fold forward there. Don't fight the shape of your structure. Let it be a question that you're exploring and use poses wisely. You still get to rest. You still can do a forward fold, but you're not forcing your legs into internal rotation when that's structurally not available to you. Okay. So that takes us to another controversial issue anytime we do a forward fold in yoga. So child's pose is a forward fold. The trunk and the thighs are coming closer together. The hips are flexing. When you're in a forward fold, you have the option of keeping your spine relatively straight or reducing spinal curves, or you can let the spine round. Remember that every cue is valid given a certain context or intention. Classically, the pose is done with a rounded spine, but that rounding should be moderate. It's equally distributed from the sacrum to the low back, to the thoracic spine, to the cervical spine. Often teachers have heard in forward folds that they need to lift their chest and lengthen the front of their chest and basically take yourself out of the forward fold. That's a great cue for someone who's way too rounded in the pose, or if they're way too rounded in just one part of their spine, so just their upper back really rounds in child's pose, that kyphosis it's called, or even a hyperkyphosis, because the natural curve is called a kyphosis, and the structurally too much rounding, too much kyphosis is called kyphosis. So it's very confusing if you're trying to learn about these shapes. So I like to call it a hyperkyphosis. If you have way too much rounding, that hyperkyphosis in your upper back, lengthening through the chest, putting your hands on a bolster or block as your arms stretch out in front of you in child's pose is a really valid cue. So a lot of the cues are not the final shape. Most cues are trying to get you to either a neutral spine or a well-distributed forward fold, or if you're doing a back bend, a well-distributed back bend arching through the whole spine, not too much in one part. But the cues that get you to that more even distribution pull you out of the shape of the pose. Does that make sense? The cue that is corrective for an unevenly or poorly distributed back bend or forward fold are the opposite of the final shape. So if I were to say in child's pose, round your back as much as you can as a cue, that would kind of be valid. Round your back as much as you can so that we get this calming effect when all the back muscles relax and turn off. It has this relaxation effect that we're looking for. It has this restful effect. But if I tell someone to round their back as much as they can, they're going to round where it's already easy for them to round. So the lumbar flexion person is probably going to round way too much in their low back and not enough in their thoracic. Whereas someone with hyperkyphosis is going to round way too much in their upper back and not enough in their lumbar spine. So that's why teachers don't say round your back as much as you can. They often say lengthen your spine as much as you can. The problem is we have students whose spines are very, very straight. They're either born that way, but often they've trained themselves to reduce their spinal curves significantly in yoga, in Pilates, in dance, reducing the arch of their low back, reducing the rounding in the upper back until their spine is so straight that when they do child's pose, their chest drops between their knees, because often they are still widening their knees even though they don't need to, and they're just getting a pinch in the hip crease. They don't feel any rounding, and they're efforting to lengthen their spine even more to get to some sensation. And now we've come to the head and neck. In this pose, people are cued to rest on their forehead. We've got the hairline, we've got the eyebrow, we've got the crown of the head. The more readily you can get your hips all the way to the heels, it's possible to rest the crown of the head on the floor. It just touches. It's not bearing weight at all. But that gets the cervical spine to also round, another area that can often sometimes miss the stretch that it needs. You find the crown of the head by placing the heel of your hand at the third eye, so to speak, above the eyebrows or just at the eyebrow line, and then extend the middle finger. And where the middle finger reaches on the skull, that's the crown of the head. That's just a shorthand way, or a long hand, depending on how long your hand is. That's a handy way of getting to the crown of the head. If your hips don't easily reach the heels, you're more likely resting at the hairline where it is or where it used to be. And then some students will even be resting more on the forehead. All of these are okay. We're looking for the back of the neck, especially close to the base of the skull, to be lengthening. Because when we arch too much in the neck, it's a problem when it's at the top of the cervical spine. When we see lines there, a little crunching there, you'll see this especially with cyclists who are used to looking up as their back rounds on the bike. So getting them to release and lengthen the back of the neck especially is very, very helpful. In this pose, you might even take a very common variation of stacking palms and resting on the back of your hands. It's a way of lifting the floor slightly. So when a body part doesn't reach the floor, and you're trying to rest, that's when you need to raise the floor with a prop. A prop brings the floor to you. So you could even use a block under the forehead. A blanket or something softer is obviously better, but a blanket on top of a block, some way to not leave the head hanging in space is much more restful. Okay, shoulders. Shoulders are where it's at here. This is when we use child's pose early in a class. I've been to many, many vinyasa classes where the first pose you do is child's pose. I always thought that was so interesting. Child's pose is not a great pose for me to start in as a lumbar flexion person, but fine, I get it. In child's pose, when you sweep the arms overhead or reach forward through the arms, it's often cued. The shoulders are in flexion. When that happens, the shoulder blades need to widen and upwardly rotate. So we're looking for the bottom corner of each shoulder blade to have widened all the way to the midline of the side of the body. So you could even feel with your hands that when that arm is overhead, we're looking for the bottom corner of the shoulder blade to have wrapped around the side of the rib cage, and then we know that the shoulder is in a great position. Now, you're not weight bearing on your hands in child's pose. So this is a wonderful opportunity, if your students are comfortable here, to start to work on the shoulder mechanics. So if we say reach your arms forward, many students are going to reach until their shoulders are up in their ears, the elbows are pointing out, and their shoulder blades have squeezed, and their chin may have even lifted. So instead, we want to capitalize a little bit on how the rounded shape helps the upper back broaden. It helps the shoulder blades widen. We can wrap those shoulder blades around and press the hands down. So if you're pressing your palms down, I would say press into 2 blocks. Why? Why do I want to raise the hand here? If I raise the hand on a block, it helps to elevate the whole underside of the arm, which helps align the arm with the back body instead of the chest. Most of us, our arms are already pulled forward towards the front body. Child's pose only encourages that. If we raise the hands up on blocks, or if we come up to what I call spider tip fingers. But in child's pose, if you come to spider tip fingers, and instead of being on the pads of your fingers, be on your nails, clicky-clacky, like if you had acrylics, right? So imagine you're balancing on your artificial nails. And by elevating the hand in that way, the whole underside of the arm can lift. And you can say, float your armpits up towards the ceiling. Fingertips stay on the floor. Draw the head of the arm bone back into the socket as you keep the undersides of the arms working. It's a great way to get some muscular work across the upper back, right along the underside of the shoulder blades. And it wraps around the sides of the shoulder blades and continues down through the outer arm. The armpits will be facing not out, but the floor. So we've got that cupping action we always want to see in the armpit area when the shoulders are overhead. The armpit's not flattened and it's not facing outwards. The armpit cups when the arm is correctly rotated, and it's deep, it's pitted, it's concave, it's a little cave. And sometimes the image has been to imagine a hot air balloon. So you're in child's pose, you're on your fingertips, you've drawn the head of the arm bone back, and you're imagining a hot air balloon lifting under the armpit to elevate that space and to draw the shoulders onto the back. Oh my Lord, this is such an important feeling for you to know and learn as a student, and to learn it in a non-weight bearing shape first. Or I'm sure you've been doing the poses long enough if you're listening to this podcast, but start to train your shoulders how to move correctly out of weight bearing. Because once you're weight bearing, your brain's just going to either shut down movement to try to keep it safe. It'll shut down your range of movement to try to minimize negative sensation or a sense of instability. or your body just defaults to its most habitual thing because weight bearing on our arms is really unusual, except in a yoga class. So practice this in child's pose. Such a great opportunity. Thanks for joining me for part 1 of Child's Pose. Your 3 takeaways for this episode are to understand whether or not you need to speed up hip flexion or slow it down so that you're not irritating your low back in this pose, or that you get the stretch if you need it. The second takeaway is use props to make this pose work for you so that it feels restful. Your third takeaway is go ahead and use this pose to train your shoulders in a non-weight-bearing way. Join me next time for part 2 of Child's Pose, where we'll explore variations like broken toe pose, thread the needle, puppy pose, and of course, a supportive, nourishing, restorative child's pose using all the props that really capitalize on this pose's ability to help you find deep rest. Thanks for joining me. I hope to see you next time. My name is Sarah Westbrook. Namaste.